If you raised a little lamb, would you ever put your little lamb into a wolf's den? Probably no one would. I attended a diversity workshop several years ago that made me think about how the lamb could live with the wolf. At this workshop, the whole school community was invited to sit at the auditorium. A few minutes later, a small Asian guy stood on the stage and he asked us, "Who do you think I am?" When he asked this unexpected question, people didn't respond right away. Then he continued to ask, "Can you guess my educational background? How about my job?" People slowly started to respond to his question. I didn't raise my hand or answer back, but I just quietly thought, he must be a computer engineer, or he must have an MBA degree. I don't know why, but I automatically thought he was a successful Asian businessman. However, what he said was, "My name is Eric Law, and I'm an Episcopal priest, and I finished my PhD degree in the Boston area, and I am the director of the Kaleidoscope Institute, and I will lead the diversity workshop today." After he shared his personal background, I was a bit surprised because I would never ever thought that he was a priest. The audience was also a bit surprised, and actually I heard little whispers from the audience. People easily saw him as an ordinary person. However, once they realized Eric was educated and ordained and the director of an institute, they saw his power immediately. In other words, they realized Eric, a small and powerless Asian man, and was an important and powerful person later. People saw him as the lamb first, and they later saw him as a wolf. Out of Law's painful experience of being discriminated, he realized that Christians should focus on finding answers and strategies to follow Christ's call to serve in every person, regardless of gender, race, and language, and culture, and power. His workshop was created out of his experience of not being heard and seen as an Asian minority. He dared to envision God's peaceful kingdom on earth based upon Isaiah chapter 11. His first book was called "The Wolf Shall Dwell with the Lamb." As a result, overwhelming numbers of requests came to him and asking him to give lectures and workshops across the United States, Canada, Australia, Asia, and Europe. So he came to our school to educate us about the importance of diversity and its relationship with power dynamics. Eric Law developed a multicultural methodology to make a peaceful, multicultural community. In order for this to happen, he educated the multicultural community on how to create a peaceful kingdom in one's own community. Everyone from my school, from the janitor to the president, was called and invited to Law's short keynote speech about the importance of the peaceful multicultural kingdom. Then we were all invited to meet as a small group to discuss about the school's mission statement. I would never thought about that. I would be a person who would think about the change of the school mission statement. In my small group, I was able to have a discussion with a professor, student, dean, school staff, and a facilitator from the Kaleidoscope Institute. It was a very partial and very temporary experience of being at God's peaceful kingdom. However, I experienced empowerment. I felt big. And I began believing that creating a God's peaceful kingdom in our everyday life could be possible. Yes, creating God's peaceful kingdom is not just an idea. Rather, it is God's command. Anybody can be equal member of the community in God's holy mountain. More surprisingly, relational harmony in this peaceful kingdom is not only a combination of different animals, but it also requires enemies to live together. What makes it possible for the little lamb to live with the wolf? If the wolf gives up his power and has love for the lamb and see the lamb not as a food but as a family, the lamb, the wolf can live together in harmony. But where can we actually see this? Can we actually see this in the Bible and in our real life? It might not be perfect, but we can find a glimpse of this God's peaceful kingdom in the Bible and in our real life. In the traditional Confucian family, the relationship between the mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law could be symbolized as a relationship of the wolf and the lamb. Therefore, most daughters-in-law do not want to live with their mothers-in-law. These days, a lot of mothers-in-law also do not want to live with their daughters-in-law too. From my counseling experiences, a lot of middle-aged Korean woman clients reported their deep agony and anguish their mothers-in-law gave them. Thus, creating a peaceful family relationship between the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law has always been troublesome. However, in the Bible, there is a story of Naomi and Ruth who don't fit the category of this traditional Korean in-law relationship. As a daughter-in-law, Ruth begged to live with her mother-in-law even though her husband died. As a single woman, she requested to live with her mother-in-law to death. What made Ruth make a decision to live and serve her mother-in-law? As you may know, Naomi was an Israelite woman who, during a famine, had gone with her family to live in the country of Moab. When her husband and 2 sons died, she decided to return to her hometown, Bethlehem. She had 2 daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. All 3 women were widows. In our modern society, a widow is free to remarry after her husband dies, but in ancient Israel, this was not the case. After her husband's death, the widow was still considered to be a part of her dead husband's family because marriage joined families as well as individuals. Her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, were Moabite women, not Israelites. The Moabite people were traditional enemies of the Israelites because there was a frequent warfare between these two countries, and according to the Israelites' belief, Moabites originated from the act of incest between Lot and his older daughter. So Israelite people believed that the whole nation was intrinsically tainted and inferior. Regardless of historical relationship between these two countries, Naomi loved these two daughters-in-law so much that she wanted them to stay in Moab and remarry and be comforted and enjoy their new lives with their new husbands. From their traditional cultural background, this decision was countercultural, and beyond that, it was an act of love. Finally, Orpah decided to return to her people and the Moabite way of life, but Ruth didn't return to her country. Even in the biblical story, Ruth declared, "Wherever you go, I will go. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this to me, and more as well, and even if death departs me from you." Generally speaking, powerless daughter-in-law, Ruth asked Naomi to live with her. Where on earth this happened to a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law? First, when we look at Ruth's love for Naomi, we marvel at their relationship that is overflowing with love. However, if Naomi had not loved Ruth in the first place, this relationship, this remarkable event would have never happened. It would never have been possible. Second, Naomi did not abuse her power over Ruth. Rather, she threw her power away. In this time of crisis, she could have been cared for because it was just her right. It was culturally given. Naomi could have demanded, "Ruth, you shall live with me." Just like how every wolf shall eat the lamb, Naomi's right to be cared was culturally okay. However, Naomi saw Ruth as one individual woman and cared for her future possibility. God's love changed everything. God's love changed the wolf and the lamb. The knowledge of the Lord in God's holy mountain is love. When God's knowledge governs people's relationship, their relationships can be changed. Relationships between the lamb and the wolf, relationship between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, and relationships between the power and the powerless. When God's love penetrates through our parents and family and the church and the country, the relationships become loving, caring, and mutual, like God's holy mountain. Like Naomi, God's love overflows in my life, and it created a peaceful kingdom within my family too. 13 years ago, my husband and I went to the United States to pursue our study and ministry. We both were able to study and have opportunities to serve the people of God in the States. Right after we moved to the States, we got very sad news that my father-in-law got a stroke with severe mental complications. We were about to settle our new life in the States with 2-year-old Jane. When we were told about my father-in-law's disease, we both were shocked. We both flew Korea right away, and we found out his condition was pretty severe. My husband wanted to stay in Korea to take care of his father. My husband told me to go back to the States with Jane and finish my study. He did not want to sacrifice my future because of his father. I sobbed inside and begged him to go back to the States with me. I loved my father-in-law deeply, but I did not want to sacrifice my family. I was helpless and powerless at the moment of my family crisis. My mother-in-law also struggled to accept this reality. She had to take care of her husband, who had always been a respected pastor. Due to his disease, he was unable to have a normal life and had to resign his ministry. At this time of family crisis, my father-in-law called us and told us, and even insisted us to go back to the States. My father-in-law said with a pale face, "I don't want to ruin my children's dream because of my disease. Please go back to the States and do what you have been dreaming of for a long time." We all cried silently. Even though his body was weak, his love for us was stronger than ever. In the airplane, my husband and I were both quiet. Even though my body moved to the States, my father-in-law's love for us stayed with me forever. At that time, I decided it will be my responsibility to serve my parents, not because I was the first son's wife, but because I wanted to share the love that he shared with me. At that moment, I became the lamb, and my father-in-law became the wolf in God's holy mountain. Then I was able to understand Ruth and why she wanted to stay with her mother-in-law. It was and is because of God's love. Ruth loved Naomi so much to the point where she could sacrifice her life. My father-in-law loved us and gave us freedom to pursue our dreams. As a Methodist bishop, he did not succeed in things like church buildings, but he succeeded in sharing God's love and creating God's holy mountain in my heart. His powerful sacrifice and love spread into my heart when he was at his weakest. Sisters and brothers of Chungdong community, Shall the little lamb live with the wolf? If the wolf comes not in power, but in weakness, if the wolf comes in not in hunger, but in love, if the wolf is governed not by his impulse, but by God's love, the lamb shall live with the wolf in God's holy mountain. We have to remember that the prophet Isaiah envisioned this peaceful kingdom not at a peaceful time of Israel, but at a politically dangerous and unsafe time. Israel was threatened by powerful foreign countries like Assyria or Babylon. Instead of a peaceful kingdom, the country was in a dangerous position. However, Isaiah prophesied to the people of Israel, no matter what happens, if your faith is with God, God will create a peaceful kingdom on earth. As God's peaceful kingdom was prophesied during the national crisis, our Savior Jesus Christ also comes to us not in power, but in weakness. Naomi and my father-in-law all followed Jesus Christ, who came in weakness. The wolf in God's holy mountain comes in weakness, not in power. Eric Law was able to start his project because of his painful discrimination and racism. Naomi kept her faith while she lost her husband and lost 2 sons in the famine. My father-in-law succeeded through love during his most vulnerable time. Jesus Christ comes to the weak, not to the strongest. That is the time when we can create God's holy mountain within ourselves, in our family, in our church, and in our country. Then we will see the tension between the wolf and the lamb, and among family members and church members and people in our nations. Because creating God's peaceful kingdom is difficult. However, if we see each other as an image of God, if we see each other as God's precious child, if we see each other as God's gift, we will see that God's peaceful kingdom will unfold God's diverse creation on earth. God's peaceful kingdom will be the land of freedom and mutuality and empowerment. And God's peaceful kingdom will let us see each other as God's beloved lamb, wolf, and child, and snake, and leopard in God's holy mountain. When you feel weak, vulnerable, and powerless, center yourself in God. Then God's overflowing love will send the wolf to comfort and shelter the lamb. If you raised a little lamb, would you ever put your little lamb into a wolf's den? Amen.